Here is Objective 4 of Module 7, and in Objective 4 we're looking at the 3 internal governance mechanisms: ownership concentration, board of directors and executive compensation, and how they're used to monitor and control managerial decisions. In this part 3 of the lecture, I'm also going to talk about Objective 5, which is the external governance mechanism, market for corporate control. What we will do here is work through each of the characteristics, their strengths, their reasons, and their strengths, their reasons, their limitations. And then once we've talked about those, you will see there's a number of videos that explain aspects of corporations and governance on the Moodle website. The exercise that flows out of here, which links directly with the Moodle forum, is a video on WeWork and the rise and fall of WeWork, and the activity will be for the Moodle forum for you to look at that video and identify and describe the internal and external mechanisms that you see in that example. I'm sorry, I do have a little bit of a cough today, but I'm working through it as best as I can. I'm not sure whether it's because I had a flu injection yesterday or something more sinister, or just something less sinister. So, the role of governance mechanisms, as I said, we're looking at ownership concentration, boards of directors, executive compensation as our internal governance mechanisms, and as our external governance mechanisms, the market for corporate control. So let's start by looking at ownership concentration. Ownership concentration is when there's a large block of owners that have a strong incentive to monitor management closely. So if a firm or group of people, an institution or an individual company owns 5% or more of shares in another organisation, it is worthwhile to spend time, effort and expense on monitoring that investment. And at 5%, sometimes it means that they'll have met a threshold, not a legally applicable threshold, but maybe a moral or ethical threshold, to be able to obtain board seats, which will enhance their ability to monitor the firm effectively. In many jurisdictions, financial institutions are legally forbidden from directly holding board seats. However, we do see that people that are independent directors or people that were formerly senior within particular institutions often do hold those positions. So it's a little bit of a balance there, but you won't see the Commonwealth Bank on the board of an organisation it is the banker for. The institutional owners, financial institutions such as stock and mutual funds and pension funds, have increasing influence over the operations of the firms if they in fact choose to exercise it. Now, mutual funds, superannuation funds as they're called in Australia, are an example of that type of fund. They own businesses, they own proportionate businesses, they own shares, and they can influence the behaviour of those companies. For example, UniSuper has significant investments in Transurban. It owns 49% of the Adelaide Airport. It has significant investments in the Sydney Airport. It means that it can, as an institutional investor, have influence on the direction of top-level management. A key example of that influence is, in fact, Members Equity Bank. You may have read just recently that Members Equity Bank, as it can do within the way that its loans are structured, took the drawbacks out of the mortgages. That's the money that people have paid ahead. So they've got this money, this redraw money sitting in their home loans. Members Equity Board made a decision because of the current COVID situation, the current economic situation of large numbers of people losing their jobs, that they would take that money and apply it to the loan balance, as removing the ability to redraw. Now, Members Equity is a bank that is owned by multiple superannuation funds, multiple industry superannuation funds. They did that on a Friday. By the Saturday, there was announcements from some of the member owners, some of the large superannuation funds, that there would be a please explain. And within a week, they had reversed that decision because it was not seen as a decision that should have been taken in that way. Now, to be quite truthful, people went, oh, shock, in particular media in Australia, particularly News Corp-owned media, who were a bit anti-superannuation, pro-private sector funds, talked about how shocking that was, forgetting that less than 18 months before, the Commonwealth Bank had done exactly the same thing. So they changed that decision, they changed that choice. Large institutional investors can put blocks or influence companies about their ethical investment, the nature of the countries, companies they invest in, the nature of some of their business activities. So they can, in fact, play that role. Shareholder activists also play that role. They can, particularly if they have a particular percentage, or when even sometimes that percentage can have a disruptive effect on company meetings, and use institutional activism to create a premium on the good corporate governance, the good corporate governance behaviour, good corporate citizenship of firms. And sometimes managerial shareholder ownership aligns with the interest of shareholders, which increases the manager's power. So what do we mean by managerial share ownership? There are two types of managerial share ownership. There's a managerial share ownership that is acquired as part of a compensation package that may grow significantly as managers stay in a role and become more and more successful, extend their period of time, get more bonus shares. The other type of managerial shareholders is when you have executive chairman or executive directors that are actually both officers of the company, managers within the company, but also have significant shareholdings themselves that may not have been acquired through a share ownership scheme. The latter part of that could be Elon Musk's share bonuses. I mean, he's a significant investment in Tesla, but some of the performance goals that Tesla has about market cap meant that he received enormous bonuses when the value of the shares reached a particular level, which may have been a conflicting incentive for him and influenced the nature of the strategy. But there's always going to be debate about that. The second method of control, internal mechanism of control, is the board of directors, who is the representatives of the owners. The board of directors is the video explaining the roles and responsibilities for the board of directors on Moodle, which I'm going to ask you to watch after this. The board of directors has the power to direct the affairs of the organisation, to punish and reward managers, and to protect the rights and interests of shareholders. That's their role, that's their direction. Sometimes the board of directors is limited because it also includes members of the top management team. So you have insiders, it might be the CEO, other top level managers. You have related outsiders, individuals not involved with the firm's day-to-day operation, but do have a relationship with the firm. Solomon Lew, the owner of Premier Investments, used to be on the board of Myer, or attempted to be on the board of Myer, definitely was on the board of John Martin Retailers, even though his company was a major supplier to John Martin Retailers, which created certain conflicts of interest, allegedly created certain conflicts of interest. And finally, outsiders are independent directors, people who are independent of the day-to-day operations and do not have other relationships with the firm. Just recently we saw the head of Disney, who had been on the Apple board, withdraw from being on the Apple board. He'd been on the board of Apple for 10 years. He's the CEO and chair of Disney. He withdrew from that, almost coinciding with the decision and the process of launching Disney Plus, which clearly has a direct conflict of interest with Apple TV and some of the other distribution. So at that point, he withdrew to avoid that appearance of conflict of interest. Some of the criticisms of boards of directors are that they don't always fulfil their fiduciary duty to protect their shareholders. They're too ready to approve managers' self-serving initiatives, possibly overvaluing the need to retain a CEO. They can be exploited by insiders with personal ties to the board members. And that can also be because the board members, particularly internal insiders, may have more actual knowledge than the board member. They're not vigilant enough in monitoring CEO behaviour, and there's a lack of agreement about the number and appropriate role of outside directors. Flowing from that, sometimes it's rarer in Australia to see somebody who's both the chairperson and the CEO. In the US, it's quite common, though there have been quite strong rulings that have called for that type of separation. Elon Musk used to be both chair and CEO. As part of a set of agreements, he's now only the CEO. He's now only the chair. He's the chair. No, he's CEO. He's now only the CEO. There's been significant separation, an independent chair, several independent directors to actually create a more normal, a board that now appears on the surface to be able to service the needs of all shareholders rather than just the dominant shareholder, which is Elon Musk. He's also been told he's not allowed to tweet certain things anymore because he tweeted things that were things you should not be tweeting, related to a takeover, taking the firm private and things like that. Though this week or last week he said that he thought his personal opinion was Tesla shares were overpriced, and that was apparently well within the bounds of what he was legally able to say, because it was just his opinion, not something that was directing the direction of the company. Fine lines exist in the world. How do we enhance the strength of a board of directors? More diversity in background, not only ethnic background, but there are boards that are full of only accountants or economists. There are boards that are full of only engineers or doctors, depending on the industry that they're in. And sometimes that means you get a singular attitude, a singular set of directions, and that lack of diversity leads to groupthink or leads to a failure to understand some ethical, moral and governance issues that might arise. Stronger internal management and accounting control systems, a strong independent auditing committee, more formal processes to evaluate the board's performance, more collaborative working and open debate, appointing a reasonable number of outsiders, and ensuring directors have an ownership stake through some level of shareholding, so that their decisions, their performance is based on the performance of the company in some respect, not just on the performance of the companies that they may actually come from that have some type of relationship with the company they're on the board of. The third internal mechanism is executive compensation. Salary. The forms of compensation that there are salaries, bonuses, performance-based long-term incentives, which can include things like share options. There are some issues about how you align those compensation packages with the outcome of the rewards you're giving your top management team. One of the issues is that you should only align those rewards related to top-level, complex, non-routine decisions over an extended period, rather than benchmarks that can be just tactically dealt with. And secondly, there are other variables that affect the firm's performance over time, such as economic, social, and legal changes. And sometimes, one of the main criticisms is you find a company that has been making a loss or has not been as profitable as some of its competitors, but the executives are still receiving bonuses, and the question is, why are they still receiving bonuses? Because sometimes they are executives that you wouldn't have that caliber of executives that have been brought in to turn the company around, to mitigate losses, to build the company for the future, if you didn't pay them the type of compensation they could get from working at a company where success was more assured. If your bonuses were tied to overseas sales, say air travel or tourism or even education in the education industry, if your rewards and compensation were based on growth and you kept those rewards and compensation based on growth, no executive would be receiving a bonus this year, no matter how well they managed the sudden decline that has occurred because of COVID-19. So the limits of the effectiveness of this as a form of controlling managers is you get unintended consequences about share options, managers achieving short-term growth to achieve their options, managers who own more than 1% of the firm's shares are less likely to be removed. That's a survey-based, a statistically based piece of analysis that's based in research. And it may well be that you want to get rid of a manager with a holding and it becomes more difficult. And finally, executives benefit from big increases in the overall value of their shares, even though the firm's shares underperform the market. And again, I gave you that caveat where you have to actually look at what the reason for that is, because there may be more than one reason. To effectively implement good corporate compensation policy and procedure, good executive compensation policy and procedure to achieve strategic goals, to have good governance in executive compensation, you really need to have a focus on a section within the board that closely monitors performance in the business units and divisions, not just the overall company, and compensate corporate executives in that way, taking into account, of course, as we'll talk about later in this unit, that sometimes it is okay to have objectives and performance that, in fact, don't serve just a single division, because the purpose of doing something in one division may be to benefit the whole organisation. You just write your corporate, which is often in related linked and related constrained organisations, you just have to write your compensation structure to reflect those things. Individuals and firms. So now the last thing to look at before I start reading the slide is the external market for corporate control. I just think I've actually put this introductory slide in the wrong place. So Objective 5 is the market for external control. The external control mechanism, the external governance mechanism. I will breathe. Objective 5 is the external corporate governance mechanism, the market for corporate control. Market for corporate control is whether the firm is going to be taken over by somebody else. The market of corporate control acts as a restraint on top levels managers' decisions, because the decisions they make can affect whether or not they have ongoing employment or ongoing bonuses or ongoing benefits, because the performance of the company influences whether the company is a takeover target or not. So the market for corporate control, individuals and firms buy or take over undervalued corporations. Ineffective managers in undervalued corporations normally are replaced in such takeovers, so their job disappears. The threat of takeover can also mean that the firm tries to operate more efficiently or effectively. And changes in regulations, however, have made hostile takeovers more difficult, but that doesn't mean they can't occur. One way that managers deal with this external governance mechanism is through a series of defence tactics to make takeovers more difficult. Restructure assets through divestments, change the financial structure of a firm, such as repurchasing shares, which up the share price, mobilise shareholders to not approve a takeover. So the market for corporate control lacks the level of precision of the internal mechanisms. Sometimes the managerial defence tactics are things that are actually about the board fully endorsing it because they do believe in the strategic direction of the firm and the performance of the management of the firm, and they can see that the hostile takeover may be in fact opportunistic, that they would be better for keeping the firm, keeping control and ownership of the firm, because the future, they've already taken the pain and they'll get the future gains. Okay, so what have we done in this whole lecture? We've defined corporate governance and explained why it's used to monitor and control managers' decisions. We've explained why ownership has been largely separated from managerial control in a modern corporation. We've defined an agency relationship and managerial opportunism and their strategic implications. We've explained both the internal governance mechanisms and the external governance mechanisms. There are now a number of videos that I've included that explain these relationships. There's that activity that I want you to do related to WeWork. So it's a good idea maybe today to watch WeWork because it will wrap the things that we've just talked about in Objective 4 and 5 in Part 3 of the lecture together quite neatly. I'll see you in the tutorial this week. I'll see you in the tutorial next week. Look forward to seeing your Moodle submissions.